Assalamualaikum and a very good morning. I greet to all the panelists for today. So today we are going to discuss on the issue of the distinctions between the civilian object as well as military object. So as we know, the principle of the distinction between the civilian object and the military object was explained under the Rule 7 of the Principle of Distinction, which is under the customary law of International Humanitarian Law. So the definitions and the distinctions of the principle that distinct between the civilian object and the military object was clearly explained under the international humanitarian law. However, the use of the object usually or oftenly mixed, especially during the armed conflict. So today we are going to discuss in this forum, we are going to discuss on how to distinguish or on how to distinctions between the civilian object and the military object during the armed conflict. So we are today we have 6 panelists that going to explain to us clearly on every detail that related to distinctions between the civilian object and military object during the armed conflict. The first panel today, we have Miss Nur Ainina binti Muhammad Zul Iskandar. She's going to tell us, she's going to explain on the definitions of the civilian object. So let's welcome Miss Nina Iskandar.
Thank you, Miss Atira, as a moderator today. So, based on the question, the civilian object is defined as object that are not used for military purposes. Civilian objects are all, as we know, civilian objects are all object not military objective, which are not object by their nature, location, purpose, or use make an effective contribution to military action, or whose total or partial destruction, capture, or neutralization in circumstances ruling at the time offers as a definite military advantage. The definition of the civilian objects also is set forth in Article 52, Clause 1 of Additional Protocol 1, to which no reservation has been made. Is this I answered the question?
Is there any example added in the additional protocol relating to the civilian object? Can you give a few examples of a civilian object?
Civilian object state practice consider civilian object in civilian areas such as towns, cities, villages, residential areas, dwelling, buildings, and house. Also schools, civilian means of transportation, hospitals, medical establishment, and medical unit. Also historic monuments such as places of worship and cultural property, the natural environment as a prima facie civilian object.
So to be concluded, the civilian object is any object that used by a civilian and not for the military purpose. Is it right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
True.
All right, so thank you, Ms. Nur Ainina, for very
Thank
clear
you.
definition.
Thanks, Atia. Okay.
So let's move on to our second panel, which is Ms. Nadratul Ashikin. So today she going to talk to us or she going to explain to us what is the meaning of the military object. So just now we already heard about the definitions of the civilian object. So we need to know what is the definitions of military object so that we can distinguish between the military object as well as the civilian object. So let's welcome Ms. Nadratul Ashikin to explain on the military object. Please unmute Ms. Nazratul.
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank to the moderator and my fellow winners. We all know that the military objective is different from the civilian objects. Civilian objects defined as the object used by civilian and not used by the military purpose. In armed conflict, attacks may be only directed to the military objective, not contribution to the military action. Second is destruction offers a definite military advantage. As example of the military objective is, before you ask me, I told first.
Okay.
Uh, Example of military objective is state practice often sites establishment of the building position where enemy combatants and their material amendments are located of the military means and lights. For example, transportation and communication. Second, we can say the other dual-use facilities are concerned, such as civilian means of the transportation and communication can be used for the military purpose. Lastly is targets. Economic targets that effectively support military operation also cite as the example of the military objective.
Okay. So are you saying that there are a dual use object or dual use means in terms of military? So what can I summarize from what you're saying just now, that civilian cannot use the military object, but the military can use the civilian object by means of dual use object. Is it right?
Yes, right.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Ratu Ashrikin, for a very beautiful explanation on the military object. So before we move to on how to distinguish between the military object and civilian object, we need to know on what basis those object are misunderstood or is not clearly distinguished. So before we move to that things, we hold on first, and then we need to know what is the international armed conflict first, and what is the non-international armed conflict, because these two situations are oftenly mixed, the use of this object, where sometimes in the international armed conflict the civilian object were used for the military purpose and otherwise. So to understand the definition, or in general what is the international armed conflicts and non-international armed conflict is, we welcome Miss Miss Ainun Achafika binti Abdul Latif to explain or to define the international armed conflict as well as the non-international armed conflicts. Let's welcome.
Okay, thank you, Miss Atira, as the moderator. So, in my part, I will explain about the application of this principle in international armed conflict as well as in non-international armed conflict. So, in general, international armed conflict is those in which at least two states are involved, and they are subject to a wide range of rules, including those set out in the four Geneva Conventions and additional protocols, which include this rule 7, the principle of distinction between civilian objects and military objectives. So, in international armed conflict, the obligation to distinguish between civilian object and military objective, and prohibition on directing attack against civilian object is contained in a large number of military manuals. And there are also numerous official statements that invoke this rule. So it means that this principle has recognized as customary international law due to its wide recognition. And this practice include states that are party to the additional protocol, also the states that are not party to the additional protocol. So for non-international armed conflict, generally, non-international armed conflict are conflict that restricted to the territory of a single state, which involve either regular armed force fighting against group of armed dissident or armed group fighting each other. So, in non-international armed conflict, uh, like I said earlier, numerous states has adopted this principle as their military manual. So, and furthermore, there are also official statement that pertaining to non-international armed conflict, which refer to this rule, which is the amended Protocol 2 to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. This protocol is basically for the non-international armed conflict. And the second one is second protocol to the Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property. This is to address the historical the cultural property of a state in a non-international armed conflict. So far, no official contrary practice was found with respect to this principle either in international or non-international armed conflict. That is all.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Ainu Shafika. So, are you saying that in the international armed conflict as well as non-international armed conflict, they already stated the manual on how to use the object, the practice on how to use the object. So, generally speaking, it should not be any problems of misuse of the object for the military object as well as the civilian object. Is it right?
Yes, right.
Okay. So, thank you again for Miss Ainun Shafika. Next, we move to our fourth panel for today, Miss Nur Shahada, Siti Nur Shahada binti Harun. So today she's going to explain on how to distinguish, on how to differentiate between the use of military object as well as civilian object. Just now, we already heard the definition, the general definition of civilian object as well as military object. So the fourth panel going to explain on how to distinguish between the military object as well as civilian object. So let's welcome Ms. Siti Nur Shahadah binti Harun.
Okay, so thank you to our moderator today, Nur Atira Muhammad Zubir. Okay, so Assalamualaikum and good morning, everyone. So I'm Siti Nur Shahada binti Harun. I will talk about how to distinguish between military and civilian objects. So the prohibition on targeting attacks on civilian objects is set out in Protocol 1, amended Protocol 2, and also Protocol 3 to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. Furthermore, under the International Criminal Court, intentionally directing attacks on civilian property, that is, property that are not military rights, constitutes a war crime in international armed conflict. Means that the during war, only military objects that allowed to be attacked. It means that civilian objects is a need to be protected. Okay, so a lawful object of attack is an object which makes an effective contribution to the enemy's action by its design, position, intent or use, and the neutralization, destruction or capture will give them a military advantage. Although there is military object and that therefore it can be legally targeted, core rules on proportionality and precautions still have to be respected. Okay, we can see that military barracks and clothing factory, which is being used to store weapons during the war, is the examples of the military objects, which means that they can be attacked. Okay, so for the civilian objects, what is civilian objects? Civilian objects is the objects that cannot be attacked and need to be protected during the war. This can be whether housing area. The examples of the civilian objects have been mentioned by our first panel, which is uh, Nina Zul Iskandar. Okay, the examples of the civilian objects is the civilian areas, buildings, schools, um, places of worship, and we also can, during the war, we also can state it as civilian objects if the building is become a protected place for the civilians. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Siti Nur Shahada Harun. So the explanations was very clear. We already know on how to distinguish between the military object as well as civilian object. However, the next panelist, he going to explain to us what are the challenge that occur, especially in the non-international area, non-international situation, regarding to the challenge to distinguish between the military object as well as a civilian object. So next, let's welcome Mr. Muhammad Ashraf Hadi to explain to us on how to distinguish on how or what is the challenge to distinguish between the civilian object as well as military object? Let's welcome.
Okay, thank you, moderator. Uh, so my topic is to cover about the challenge between the civilian object and military objective. So, firstly, the challenge to avoid the challenge in the uh, Geneva Convention, there is a law about disproportionate attack. To avoid the unlawful attack to about to target the loss of civilian and civilian object. So uh, both parties must avoid the disproportionate attack uh, in targeting the civilian, and also the challenge of scope come from the terms of dual use object, that as we know that dual use object is object that serve both for civilian and also the military purpose. And for your information, in ICRC, there is no legal term about the dual use object, because the actual definition of dual use objects is must be accorded to the also to the additional protocol 1 of Geneva Convention. And for the example of the value object, for example, the bridge, airport, and the most controversial, I would like to give an example. The most controversial of the value object is the radio and television. I would like to give the four cases about the radio and television that's been the dual use object in nine, 1999, about the the Kosovo War. They involved the Serbian and Kosovo when United Kingdom bombed the Serbian television TV, and many criticism about the action of United Kingdom bomb the radio television of Serbian, but the Prime Minister of United Kingdom at that time, Tony Blair, said that the television is being the use of Serbian propaganda to attack the Kosovo, and also in the Rwanda case in 1994, that Rwanda the apa putus use the television as the to mobilization of his army to attack against the Tutsi. So in this term, the radio and television can use as the military objective, but must not violate the principle of proportionality, because there is the four principle in the additional protocol 1 about the military objective. First, distinction. Second, military necessity. Three, proportionality. And four, unnecessary seats of humanity. And Geneva Convention also want to minimize the civilization casualty and damage through the Article 57 of Additional Bridge Fund about the planning of attack. Very careful planning of attack, not to target the civilian, and also yes, civilian, and to avoid the many casualty for the civilian. Okay, that's all.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Mr. Ashrafadi. So, from the explanation that Mr. Ashrafadi has told us, between about the challenge of to distinguish between the civilian object as well as military object, I can say that the main challenge occur is the dual use of object, because there are no clear definition on the dual use object. So, more or majority of the military or a majority of the military attack or operations are used by means of dual use object. So to justify the
Yes,
attack, to justify the attack. So even though there are
yes,
large military manual, even though they have an international humanitarian law, but still the challenge to distinguish between the civilian object and military object cannot be that. So to know better or to know more about the principle to distinction between the civilian object and military object, we need to know what is the example of the case, and what is the the case or the situation that occur where this military object and civilian object are misused. So let's welcome Ms. Nurul Amalina to explain to us the case or the example where the distinctions between the civilian object and military object during the armed conflict occur. To avoid any misconnection in the middle of your explanation, like can you summarize what is the case study and the example relating to this issue?
Okay, to summarize that, how the civilian object used for military purposes is that when the when the situations that comes from the civilian to military, for example, I choose as the school roof. If the school roof had been stationed or the others protected place like hospital, places of worship must remain protected as long as military action is not being deployed therefrom. So if so for the reverse situation, when military objective becomes a civilian object, as for instance, a large military base that is converted to a collection point for the wounded and is thus rendered immune to attack. So
Is there any things that you want to add regarding to your example relating to this issue?
no.
Okay, so the things because of the poor connection, the things that I can conclude is that the case you can refer to the case of Israel use the civilian object for the purpose of military object, but overall, the distinction between civilian object and military object occur when the military purpose or the military operation use the civilian object for the military purpose. So any civilian object, any transportation that or building that is used for the civilian object for the civilian purpose, but at the end was used for the military purpose, that's where the distinction or the principle of distinction between the military object and civilian object come across. So after
Yes.
every explanation was been made by our six panelists, we can conclude that uh, the principle of distinction between the civilian object and military object under the Rule 7 of the principle of distinction of the customary international humanitarian law has clearly classified what is the civilian object as well as the military object. However, during the armed conflict situation, the misconception of or the misuse of this object cannot be denied, because there always a problems where the military purpose or the military operation use the civilian object for their own means, for their own purpose, by use of by means of the dual use object. So even though there are many international law or many military manual that already classify or clearly define this object, but there are still misconception between the civilian object and and military object. So we come across to our at the end of our forum. Is there any things or any point that any panelists want to add on? You can do so now. No. So if there are no additional info, I think that we can end our forum for today with the note that the international armed conflict or the international humanitarian law, as well as the manual of the military, cannot define or cannot clearly define any civilian object or military object, especially in the situation of armed conflict. So our panel agree with my statement.
Yes, we agree.
All right.
Yes, I agree.
Thank you.
I
Beautiful.
agree.
So let's end our forum for today, and thank you everyone that come and that participate in our forum for today, especially to know better on the distinction between the military object as well as civilian object. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, moderator.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Thank you.
All right.